we didn't hit 10 million uniques per month until 2010. One story we've heard over and over again for users that end up sticking around and becoming like Redditors is I noticed Reddit, like it kept coming up in search results, or I started seeing it in here, or I'd ask a question and it would come up. And, I kind of casually used it for some period of time, usually like months to years. And then I found this thing, and then I discovered I was coming back every day. So that first summer, all of the content that was on Reddit, it was either being submitted by Steve and Alexis, or it was being submitted by a bunch of, like YC and Associated.
What's crazy to me as an outsider is just that a company that today does like nearly $1 billion in revenue, 5 years in had trivial amounts of revenue. It's just crazy how long some of these things can take until you, I guess, get the balance right and can really start monetizing.
Oh, 100%. And I think the flip side of it, though, is that like what we didn't appreciate at that point was that the product had, again, to use modern terms, it had immediate product market fit. The magic of Reddit was there was never any question about like, we never even thought about marketing. Like there wasn't any need to market. There wasn't any need to do any kind of like lead gen, right? Like
people listening right now, they just hate you. Welcome to the Product Market Fit Show, brought to you by Mistral, a seed stage firm based in Canada. I'm Pablo. I'm a founder turned VC. My goal is to help early stage founders like you find product market fit. Well, Chris, welcome to the show.
It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Reddit is, a world-known brand now. It's a $9 billion company. Nearly $1 billion in revenue, over 1 billion MAUs. And you're not just a CTO. I mean, you were the founding engineer. You were there from day one. I mean, it's a long story. Like we're 2024 now. This is like 2005. We're going back almost 20 years. So I'm excited to dive into like those early days, right? Just what it was like to start. The world was so different. You were in YC's first batch, right?
Yeah. So actually I was probably, I don't think I wasn't there quite first day, but I was definitely there, within the first 6 months. Quick version of me is I was actually in grad school at that point, mid 2005, had gotten roped into working on a startup with a friend, which at that point, to set the stage, nobody was doing startups in 2004 and 2005 really. That was like it was still pretty deep in the hangover from the original .com bust, which honestly, to go back even further, like, so I was actually class of 2000. So I was in that boat of, I decided to go to grad school, that fall, but I had all these friends that were coming out to California and like getting these like great signing bonuses and like these fantastic jobs. And then by September, I started grad school and none of those jobs actually existed anymore. The whole place had cratered. I was like, so all summer I'm like kicking myself like, oh man, I should have joined that startup. And it's like, oh, that startup is no longer there because the market no longer exists. But yeah, 4 years later, I was kind of like halfway through grad school, hit that point of burnout that I think everyone goes through at some point in grad school, and did like a side project that turned into a startup. The nice results of that summer was I learned how hard it is to start a company. My company cratered that summer, but I had 2 free bedrooms in my apartment, and Steve and Alexis from Reddit moved in. They were friends from that batch. And then I think it was probably 2 months or so before Steve kind of coaxed me to help out and help out turn it into first employee. And the rest, as they say, is history.
It's history. Yeah, that's right. The other 20 years, that's easy stuff.
Yeah, so like the next 19 years, yeah, so whatever. Things happened. It's mostly scene deleted, like in The Simpsons. It's like, oh, I don't know what happened in that intervening time. No state.
I have to ask, like, what was like? Do you remember? I mean, it was a long time ago. Like, do you remember what the vibe was like in YC back then? Because now Paul Graham, like, he's a legend. Like, YC is, within the world of startups, like the number one most well-known thing, like not just accelerator, just like brand, I would say in general. Maybe Sequoia is like up there, but that first batch, like why do people even join? You know what I mean? Like, was Paul Graham a big deal? Like, what was the idea?
I mean, Paul Graham had a big cult following at that point. Like Paul Graham was like he was, I don't know if notorious is the right word. He had a tech blog that he still has. That I still have been reading all these years. He was also very big in the Lisp community. He wrote the 2 textbooks on Lisp. In fact, it was one of those things that I actually found out, like, I discovered after I met Paul and knew him for a while, that the Lisp book that I had on my shelf was actually his. Nice. And those moments of like, oh, my freshman year Lisp book from '96, this is actually Paul's. That's pretty funny. I'd say that the defining characteristics of YC in the early days was like they actually would oftentimes chafe at the idea of calling them an accelerator, because they were trying to do something that was much more straightforward of just like, Paul's thesis was, to use modern terms, if there was liquidity available for smart founders to go and start a company, and if you could just kind of like set them loose, give them a little bit of seed funding and set them on their way, then that would create this rich ecosystem of startups that would actually thrive. And I think that if any bet has been proven to be true, it's that one, which is that we now know in retrospect that like startups have like a 90+% failure rate, right? And so it's very much like it's an ensemble sort of situation where you have to have a couple of successes pay off the long trail of failures. But like many things in life, the only way to become a good, successful startup founder is to kind of like do it a couple times and learn how to learn the knocks live. Like you can, it's like it feels like the first time I read a management book when I was kind of middle of my career. I remember reading it being like, I don't understand what any of this stuff means. And then you go and you manage for a while and you're like, you get a couple scars and you come back and you read the book and it's like, oh, now I understand what this toolkit means.
Right.
It's the same thing with startups. It's like you start a company and it's like, oh, how hard could it be to start a company? And then you're like, apparently payroll is a thing. Who knew? Who knew? Or like managing investors, like managing a board. Like you kind of have to do all that stuff live before you really can appreciate like how what parts are complicated and what parts just require some skill.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many pieces of the puzzle when it comes. It's actually like that's one of the frustrations almost is like you have this idea, you just want to deliver a product, and then you just find out like all the little friction, all the little things you got to do to just like get that idea into reality, right? And you only learn that by going through it.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and on top of it all, like one of the signs of a successful company is you have to go through the phase of like growing the team. And then you discover that, speaking from experience here, it's like, I spent my entire career as a software engineer effectively. And when you go through that shift of having to actually, your output is not the software, it's the people who are building the software now. And you become more and more removed from the actual day-to-day software development. At this point in my career, I've got 1,000 people in my org, which every time I say it, I just kind of shudder a little bit. It's like, that's a lot of people who are looking to me for some sort of like guidance on what's going on. It's like, I'm just some guy who likes to write code, but, don't get to do that as much anymore. I mostly threaten to write code.
So take me back. Like, I'm really curious because you're working on this other startup. You're in the same batch as Reddit, but like, how do you actually end up joining Steve and Alexis?
Oh, I mean, it wasn't much more complicated than what I mentioned. It was like, legitimately, that batch was very small. So that was, there's 10 startups, that batch. And I think actually we had the first company flameout happened within the first like literal 3 or 4 weeks of the batch. So I think we actually were down to 9 within a few weeks. It was like till all this time. It was like the disagreement about equity division between the team or something. Which again, in retrospect, it just seems so silly. It's like you're divvying up a company that doesn't exist yet and like arguing is how much you own. It's like, oh,
it's a bad sign. It's a
really bad sign. It's a sign of lack of. It's like actually that's probably it's a sign of like immediate lack of trust. It's like they don't actually trust each other enough. And but that was a wild first batch. I mean, like some of the folks in that batch, besides Reddit, there was Justin Kahn and Emmett Shear from
Twitch
at the company at the time. The company was called Kiko, and it was a calendar startup. But they went on to do Justin TV shortly thereafter, which also got into a later YC batch, and then Twitch. Sam Altman was in that batch doing his startup Looped, if I remember right. It was like a social location app. Like basically the Snap Map, but back in 2005 on feature phones. So it was actually it had some pretty good solid bones in there, or at least a bunch of people who were, I don't know, in retrospect, all roughly the same kind of crazy, maybe is the way to describe it.
But like Paul Graham's pretty good at picking people.
It's like, I think he did a pretty good job on the first batch. And it was very much like, I think that the best way to describe the actual experience was like the shared context. There was no other room you could be in than that room where everyone was literally going through the same thing that summer. Everyone had just established a company. We were all learning how to build basically web apps live at a point when like Web 2 was just becoming a thing that was being talked about. And so, like, no one knew how to build scaled web products, or at least there wasn't like a kit to do it. So you're kind of like learning live, and then being able to like once a week at dinner have a chat with some other people who are doing the same thing and being like, oh, I literally just solved that problem this week. Here's what I did. First discoveries of some of the new things that come along with CSS, which, to this day remains one of the worst toolkits imaginable. I'm sorry, I'm a backend engineer mostly by training, so I got out of that early. So I mostly have completely uninformed opinions on it at this point, which, still are funny. So, from my standpoint, we were working on, sounds really mundane, but like desktop search. Like, me and my co-founder at the time were a couple of physicists who just like couldn't find PDFs on our freaking hard drives that we had downloaded because like the search toolkit that existed on computers was pretty terrible at that point. And so we ended up trying to solve the general problem of search on desktop. And this is about I don't know, I think it was that fall that it was that fall that Mac OS shipped an update where they actually gave you the search bar. Like, that's how far back in the past it was. Like, I think we were competing with that stupid dog in Windows. It would appear and like, oh, you look like you're trying to run a search. It's like, yeah, this is completely useless.
My life changed when I stopped clicking on files and I just kind of open up the search and pull up a document. That's like,
I know,
that was
it's
revolutionary.
Amazing. Yeah, it's like command space bar. Everything is command
That's
space
right,
bar at this point. But yeah, that was like still a relatively new idea. Now, of course, now at this point, like files locally, really? Like everything's in a browser window and it's probably stored somewhere else. You just have to find it.
And so walk me through, like, I guess my question is, like, when you join, what was like the MVP of Reddit? I mean, and Reddit, is actually almost known for like not changing, or at least like not changing all that much, right? And so how similar was the first version of Reddit to what we see today?
I think a lot of the basics existed all the way back to that year. So I'd say for that summer and for the first version of Reddit, it really was just a front page with a bunch of links. You could submit content, you could give it a title, and you could vote on it. And that was it. There was no conversations, there was no discussions. If I remember right, the first comments appeared later that year in like December of 2005, give or take, after I had started. So it was a major kind of like addition. And I remember also really clearly, like, setting the tone for Reddit's culture. Literally, one of the first comments that appeared was something like, Reddit has comments now. I guess it's now just Slashdot. We should all move on to the next thing. It was great. It was great while it lasted. It's like, oh yeah, it's like eternal September all the way down. Voting plus comments goes back to 2005, basically.
Crazy.
And then everything else has been, like, I think the next major addition we did was when we added subreddits closer to 2007, 2008. And I would say that was one of those things that actually kind of slowly started appearing, where initially we had created a set of, we just started finding that the amount of content being submitted was so large, we had to have some sort of an organizational principle around it. And the original idea was we started breaking it down into topics. So we curated in the first crack about 10 or so. Now we call them communities, but at the time they were just like, we just call them subreddits because they're like a chunk of Reddit around a given topic. And that was things like science, politics, basically clear delineations that the community wanted to separate out.
When I look at Reddit, at least, like, I think the most powerful asset you have is this incredibly strong community. And more so than maybe any other social network, frankly, is like the defining feature, to the point that, communities now, subreddits, can move markets, right? So it's pretty incredible. How did you get that going? Like, everybody wants to build a community, but it's so hard to do. And I'm just curious, in those early days, like, I remember stories of, seeding the threads and stuff, and like putting things there to kind of get conversation started. But do you remember how you guys got that going in 2005, 2006? Because it's easy once there's content, but it's hard when it's a blank page.
Oh yeah, 2005 was. I remember really clearly. This is right before I started. Where for that first summer, all of the content that was on Reddit, it was either being submitted by Steve and Alexis, or it was being submitted by a bunch of like YC and Associated, because we were the first users as a group, right? There was a point that Steve likes to talk about where he finally took like a day off on the weekend. Like, he just decided, like, I'm taking Saturday off. And then he went back to Reddit. I'm going to butcher his story, but like, he can yell at me later. He comes back to it the next morning and he's like, I gotta like, it's going to be stale. I'm going to go submit it. Like, to dig up a bunch of content and post it. And he opened up Reddit and there were 25 fresh links on the front page and he had nothing to do with any of them. And it was just like this, like, oh, the system seems to be working.
Starts to work.
And from that point on, like, there's no need to start creating this, like, the community like, that particular community, that very first community, which was just reddit.com, started to run itself. And it just kind of like started becoming this place where interesting content would just appear and bubble up. And so I think one of the things we got right really early on was the underlying math of just how content became popular on Reddit and how long it stayed up there was very simple. It was optimized for being able to index it on statically, so you could actually render really fast. We had it publicly in the open source version of Reddit from about 2008 till 2017. And honestly, that algorithm didn't change markedly for most of the first 15 years of Reddit. So it's a very straightforward setup, just based on like age of the content and the number of votes it got. And a lot of the work went into just making sure that the votes that we had good anti-cheating logic to make sure people weren't doing things that were inorganic. But like the core of it was very well established. Later on, that same process though worked for communities, where we noticed up front that there were a bunch of topical areas that were starting to form. And so starting to peel those off of the front page made sense. So there wasn't any real work to seed them because the content was already present. The real change was in 2008 when we actually opened up the floodgates and just said, like, hey, if you think you have a good idea for a community, go make one. And then that was like the initial burst of just like all sorts of random stuff that users started coming up with. I mean, that's where actually AMAs, which are a cornerstone of Reddit right now, were primarily something that formed on its own. It was a created community that just IAMA was formed around then. Most of the major communities that came later were ones that were just organically created by users, and that's actually the best result.
That was almost like adding fuel to the fire, right? Like there was already momentum, and you just kind of feeding it.
Yeah, 100%. And then like for to get to the other secret sauce that we have since that beginning, moderators. To start with, the first version of moderation was we just basically allowed the creator of those communities to have a similar toolkit that we had for keeping track of content. And that wasn't much more than just being able to remove content or like see reports. Subsequently, we discovered as communities got larger, they needed to be able to add more people to the moderation team. And so we basically added that permission. The feature that no one really notices that I think had the biggest impact was we gave mods the ability to edit the content on the side of the page where you could actually explain like the community, just say what it's about, because you had to be able to say like, you come to a random community, what am I supposed to be doing here? And what we found happened very quickly is that they started using that space to start to create rules of like how to use the community. And you can think about it as like in the same way that we originally created a politics community because we wanted to get politics off the front page because people were complaining. You wanted to have the opposite of like, happen where it was like, okay, actually, because we've been through multiple elections at that point, right? It's like 2008 was the election that actually kicked it over, where it was like people were tired of politics and they're like, okay, no more politics here, put it over there. We had the opposite happen where it's like, only post content to like peer-reviewed scientific articles in r/science, right? And starting to have those be a list of actual rules started creating more structure for communities to create their own culture effectively.
Is that the key thing that kind of hooks people and keeps them coming back, where they just find themselves so identified, I guess, like in these, and there's just something for everyone?
Yeah, I think that what we with hindsight, one story we've heard over and over again for users that end up sticking around and becoming like Redditors is there's this like kind of particular arc that usually goes something like, I noticed Reddit, like it kept coming up in search results, or I started seeing it in here, or I'd ask a question and it would come up. And, I kind of casually used it for some period of time, usually like months to years. And then I found this thing, and then I discovered I was coming back every day. And that thing is always very specific to the person, right? It's like, you're like a botanist, or you're a hobby gardener, and you find a community that's dedicated to your particular variety of gardening. And it's like, oh my God, I'm just gonna stick with this forever. Or like another one that comes up that's also not talked about as much is like, we actually have really good support communities. So for people who have who have wanted to stop drinking, for people who have substance abuse, for people going through divorces, we've had those can be very sticky because there's not really a place anywhere else where you can go in and be honest and talk about your actual problems and not worry about it kind of coming back to you as a person. I mean, that's kind of the magical model that we picked early on. Was we decided that we didn't want to have real names. We didn't want to have association with you. And we just relied on the fact that if you're going to waste a bunch of time creating like a fake user and a fake persona, if it's entertaining, great. Otherwise, like there's no motivation to like go and create a fake persona because it doesn't come back to you, right? So it actually cuts both ways. Like, even though we are sort of pseudo-anonymous, the incentives are such that authenticity is what comes out of that, because there's no reason to try to be like an influencer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, unless you're trying to troll, like that's almost the only reason I can think of to create like a fake persona. Yeah,
it's like that seems like a big waste of time for very little return, right? Or like, the other standard approaches, of course, that come up are like, we deal with, and again, this is like a tales of time on Reddit, spam, like trying to sell, pushing pills. That's the cornerstone of the internet, and it's like, you can either be identified as spam, or you can go through the front door and like pay for advertising. But there's that in between of it's just like, you're just wasting everyone's time and efforts. We'll just get rid of that content.
And like in those early days, like 2005, 2006, how much was it just straight organic word of mouth, and how much did like Google and Google like results play a role in kind of growth?
Oh, very early on, it was almost entirely word of mouth. In fact, in the early days, we have a lot less insight into how things spread at that point, because keep in mind, like we're older than Google Analytics. Like we used to run our own analytics toolkit. Actually, that was my first job, was doing our traffic. We used to see a bump we used to see a bump in traffic in those days in September. And what we figured was probably happening was when people would go back, like people would go to college or go back to school, there was like an opportunity for word of mouth on campus because like the sort of like the 18 through 20 was always like 20s range was always very large on Reddit. And so we had a suspicion that it was just like, yeah, you come back from the summer and now you tell all your friends about this place you found. And then it just kind of spreads that way. But it was definitely very organic. It wasn't until much, much later where, probably the last 5 or 10 years where Google's played such a large role.
Do you have a sense, like I'm trying to get a sense of magnitude, like I know it's a long time ago, but do you remember like that first year, that second year, we're talking about like 10,000 users a month, 100,000, a million, like what kind of scale were you operating at?
I looked this up because I figured you were going to ask this question. Let me actually find it. I just was complaining about it somewhere. I think that so we didn't hit 10 million uniques per month until 2010. So we're talking about like, I think we just about hit 2 million. We hit about 1 million a month in sort of mid to late 06. But at that point, we're on like a pretty good, like 3 to 6 month doubling curve. So if anything, like the rate that we were growing was about the same pace where we could actually keep the site perky. When you know everything has to be like the load's going to be twice as much in 3 months, it really kind of focuses the mind to like, okay, what's the current bottleneck that we're going to hit? And what's the next bottleneck we're going to hit? And how do we make sure we're at least a couple bottlenecks away from the actual like major outage?
How often were there like big outages in those first days? Like just didn't work?
I think that the outages were in the early days, like very early days, not particularly often, and always for something that ended up being like, we don't know how to use this technology yet. Like it's still kind of like also, oh man, without failure, we would have outages whenever the team was always very small. If the team decided to go out to dinner collectively, if like all 4 of us were in the same place, somebody's phone was going to go off. It's like a guaranteed thing. I remember very clearly like being out to dinner and like Steve's phone went off and we got back. We had to like run back to the apartment, which doubled as the office, hopped on. And that was the first time we discovered that. So we've used Postgres as our database forever. And that was the first time we actually like discovered that Postgres had configuration, like a configuration file we should look at. And like the tuned version of Postgres back in 2005 was like optimized for like a 486 with like 8 megabytes of RAM. And so I think it was probably the first time we had an index fall out of memory where it was like, oh, wow, we could just make this like, we could just add like 2 zeros to the setting and all of a sudden it works. And so like the AI was like, yeah, let's figure out what all these settings do in this particular file. And, it's just like kind of that compounded across a bunch of things. And by the way, like the impression I want to leave here isn't that we didn't know what we were doing. It was like nobody knew what they were doing at that point, and we're all kind of discovering it live.
And walk me through so the acquisition was when in 2006?
It was Halloween 06, October 31st.
And at that time, Facebook started 2004. I don't know exactly how big they were, but I'm sure things were like flying off. Like, I don't know what you guys were looking at if you were comparing yourself to them or other social networks, but I'm curious, like, what was the logic for taking that exit, especially when you had that kind of growth? Like, those numbers are pretty big, especially back then, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the breakout successes that were at the same time, Facebook was 2004, but Facebook also was still like, I think at that point, I can't remember when they rebranded from the Facebook to Facebook. Like there was the original domain was even different because it was hard to get facebook.com even then. They were mostly limited to college campuses until, a little later. But like the breakout success summer of 05 was actually YouTube. YouTube came out of nowhere and exploded, and they got bought very quickly that year by Google. I mean, for us, it was like again, this is still at a point where there really wasn't much of an acquisition path available. Like, companies were still just waking up to the idea of like startups again. The pitch at the time from Condé was actually very good, which was, Condé is this kind of premium content generator that understands monetization, and then we're an engine for getting you to content that doesn't have a monetization path.
Because you were pre-revenue, right, at the time? You guys were making
revenue. We were. Advertising was a side thought at that point. We barely had advertisement on Reddit. And, it was one of those pitches that was almost like, with our powers combined,
right.
We can take over the world. And so, and also like at that point, it's like what do we know? We're all in like our like mid to late 20s. It's kind of like, somebody comes at you and you're like, we'd like to buy this for more than you've ever seen. Like, tell me more.
That's right.
Sounds like a good idea.
The world's changed. I think now, like many first-time founders, I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, they probably take it too, but at least they would pretend they shouldn't. They're going for the unicorn,
Yeah, it was a different funding world. It was like a different, like there just weren't like, I don't think the word unicorn was coined until at least, 10 years later. And so the idea of like talking about series A, B, C, D, like that wasn't even really back, it was in the lexicon from the late 90s, but it really hadn't come back. And so it just wasn't really like a offer on the table. Sounds like a good way to do it. And then, hey, we can always go start another startup.
What was it like after acquisition? Did they like let you run things more or less the way you used to, or did things get a lot more annoying?
No, it was actually like the nice parts about working inside of Condé Nast was they did leave us to our own devices. Actually, there was a couple nice parts. One is the reason. So fun fact. Reddit was actually started in Somerville, Massachusetts, not too far from where YC was based, which was in Cambridge. And so a lot of that first summer batch was actually all in Massachusetts, not in California. And it wasn't until that winter when YC decided to do a second batch, they decided to do the winter in down at Trevor Blackwell's office in Palo Alto, I want to say. Definitely down the peninsula. And so, because like, why would you purposely inflict East Coast winters on your startup? Plus, doubles the surface area for like, if you can tap the East Coast for some knowledge, you can also tap like Stanford in that area. So the side effect of that though was when we got acquired, Condé wasn't sure where to put us, and the nearest property they could stick us next to was going to be Wired, which is based in San Francisco. And so the side effects of getting acquired, they're like, and we want you all to move out to California. I'm like, okay. So we all moved out, worked out of the Wired office for 4 or 5 years. And if anything, that was probably more fun than anything else, just getting to like, talk to folks who, have been reading their articles for like the last, 5-10 years, being in the Bay, where, kind of the center of the tech universe even then, and just kind of like generally being left to our own devices because, of course, like Condé's mothership is really in New York.
And how, I think we were talking about this before, like you guys kept the team pretty small for even after the acquisition for a while, right?
We never had more than 10 employees up until 2011. I left in 2010, late 10. And at that point, the company was like 4 engineers and some support. They had one salesperson who was actually a Condé Nast employee with some other folks who were kind of on the business side, but it was, one community manager just to start.
How come? Like these days, like if you're the next Clubhouse, you think you're the next Clubhouse, let's say, like you raise a lot of money and you hire a lot of people. Like how did you do it with 10?
Well, that's the side effect of also being acquired at that point is that we did have like a P&L and we were very heavy on the L because it was very hard to get the P. Right. It's like, right. It turns out that where the logic of the acquisition was a little wrong was trying to get people to advertise on style.com is not difficult. Trying to get the same advertisers to advertise on Reddit is extremely difficult. It's a very different, let's just say the vibe is very different.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, style, high class style publication versus like a bunch of
an angry mob
that each other.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's like so it was actually very difficult to get even like, to sort of like cover our own costs was actually very difficult. And so hiring was also difficult. One thing that also hit us was, you might recall 2008 was like a big economic downturn. Another reason where actually the acquisition was really great, because like we would have ended up in a pretty tough spot trying to get funding 2008, 2009. That period of time, there was a company-wide hiring freeze at Condé because they were worried about the downturn. And so that meant if we were growing or not, we couldn't hire. So if anything, it taught us to be, fairly lean and fairly efficient with our tech. That's also the year where we migrated into the cloud. We actually were very early AWS users, mostly because it was a lot easier to get servers by putting them on a corp card than it was to actually have to deal with like procurement and getting those, getting them shipped out and having to rack them up ourselves.
And so by the time you leave in 2010, do you remember the size of Reddit? Like, was there meaningful revenue, or were we at 10 million users a month or so?
Yeah, when I left, it was in the vicinity of 10 million users a month. And the revenue was not large enough to be worth mentioning on this podcast.
Insane.
It was pretty
That's
tiny.
Crazy.
It was, it's like we were I do remember in 2010 we launched Reddit Gold, which was our first attempt at doing something like a subscription model on Reddit. And I think in that first week we raked in at the time eye-watering number of like $100,000 from users just kind of donating to Reddit. That was a completely insanely large number in the scheme of things. Like that was larger than like the last couple of months of ad sales, if I remember right at the time. So
what's crazy to me, like as an outsider, is just that a company that today does like nearly $1 billion in revenue, 5 years in had like trivial amounts of revenue. It's just crazy how long some of these things can take until you, I guess, get the balance right and can really start monetizing.
Oh, 100%. And I think the flip side of it though is that like what we didn't appreciate at that point was that the product had, again, to use modern terms, it had immediate product market fit. Like the magic of Reddit was there was never any question about like, we never even thought about marketing. Like there wasn't any need to market. There wasn't any need to do any kind of like lead gen, right? Like
people listening
people
right now, they just hate you.
Oh no, I know. But it's like, again, it's one of those things where like we didn't realize at the time like that was like an unusual thing. And so, so actually like the fact that we had to work really hard on the revenue side, and it wasn't until the modern era like where we really started doubling down on revenue in like the last basically 2015, 2016 on was where we really had to go hard at it and figure out how to solve that particular problem. For the early days, the problem was never the users. If anything, like there were days where we were like, oh God, can they just like stop coming for one day so we can clean up this database? That'd be great. Can we just like, I just want to take the whole site down.
Right.
I need to run a full vacuum and like, just let the vacuum finish.
So tell me so then you shift, like in 2010, you and Steve, right, decide to go off and do Hipmunk. Like what's the story there?
Similar story, which was that I never come immediately, but I come eventually. So I
come
stuck
quickly.
You
just not first.
I come quickly. It took a little bit of time. So Steve left in end of 2009, and then went off and came up with an idea with a friend of ours, Adam Goldstein, to build a travel meta search site called Hipmunk. And I ended up joining about a year later, end of 2010. And I would say that, like, to go back to my point about product market fit, like, part of the design choice around Hipmunk was, let's make a very like nicely designed site and product that has immediate ways to get to revenue. And then we just have to deal with like, let's find a path where we don't have to deal with like complaining users, and we can get to revenue and, really nice product. And so we succeeded in all directions, and then realized that, of course, that the hard part is like getting people to actually come to your site is very difficult. And so, like Steve and I talked about this in retrospect. It's like, we just had this notion that we were going to like turn it on and people would just come. Because that had been the story with Reddit. In fact, if anything, like we built it with notions of scale that are just hilarious in retrospect of like, oh yeah, we like, a couple of architects who are used to dealing with like huge scale in Reddit. We'll just make this thing fast and like really scalable and easy to scale up. And scaling was never the problem. Like it was always the getting users to come. Like if you could get somebody to come back twice in a year, that was like a rampant success.
It's so funny how life does that to you, right? Like you learn all these things, like this time I'm going to get it right. And then you forget that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's like, and the side effect even was like, we ended up building a lot of systems that looked very similar to the shape of the technology at Reddit because, same architects that were building it, which meant that, when I eventually came back, or we both came back, Steve came back in 15 and I came back to Reddit in 16, it was almost like coming back to an alternate history where like they had chosen a slightly different path because we had actually diverged in our kind of like direction. Came back and found that, it's like, oh, wow, they're still using the first version of this thing that we wrote. We've already written 3 other versions, but that was a different company. Crap. Like, how does this work again?
And so what was Hipmunk? Was it like a hotels.com, like a booking.com sort of thing, or something else?
I think that the better, the closer analogy, it'd be more like in the kind of like, it turns out that there's 2 different, oh God, these are things that I didn't know I would ever have to learn about. Turns out that there are 2 things that exist for searching across multiple flight or hotel providers. There's something called an OTA, which is an online travel agent, and then there's something called metasearch. OTA actually legitimately has like a travel agent's license. That industry is weirdly regulated, and so there's actually like a whole classification system. Metasearch is like you're built on top of, you're built as like a search provider on top of other providers. And so we built Hipmunk initially as metasearch. We made our own deals with airlines, made our own deals with metasearch providers, and the idea was to become effectively an aggregator. So I think that the clearest analogy I would give would be like, if you go to Google now and you search for flights, they'll give you that kind of like overview. It's basically Google Flights, which came out again, came a couple of years into Hipmunk existing, where they decided to start making a foray into that. After they bought one of the large data providers for flight data called ITA, they started building out that product. So we initially started with flights, and then we moved into hotels because that's kind of like that's the path that everyone takes. And the reason why everyone takes that path is because it turns out that hotels are much easier to monetize than flights. Flights, you're making maybe a few dollars a ticket, whereas hotels usually get a percentage.
And so how did you end up solving it? That core user problem, which by the way is, frankly, demand is like most startups' problems. Like that is just how to get users until you get product market fit, and then then you have other problems. But that's usually the 0 to 1 issue.
Yeah, I think that Hipmunk's real differentiator was its flight product, like where we really started, and like we wanted to provide a way to solve our own problem first, which was it's just a pain to figure out which flight to take. Like you go and you're like, I have a couple of very simple requirements most of the time for looking for a flight, even to this day. And actually, I travel a lot now. And I miss Hipmunk's UI. We showed flights as a bunch of Gantt charts as like effectively like, here's a time bar that shows you when the flight is. And you can go through and you can basically say like, I want to leave after 9 a.m. and I want to arrive before this time. Show me everything that fits that. And then like, oh, look, this one has a really stupid like 8-hour layover. Like kick that out. And so we had this notion of, we created a simple sort called agony, which was like, you could sort by lowest agony.
Oh, nice.
And we give you like effectively direct flights and flights that had reasonable layovers. And reasonable layovers is like, what you'd expect. It's like 30-minute layover. That's not a real layover because the flight's going to probably be, you have to run between terminals, as opposed to like, about 2 hours is about the sweet spot. So we kind of like built out a quick little bit of math that showed that with a nice UI. And so the product really was the UI. It was like quickly being able to get to a flight that's reasonable and be able to pick your return path, be able to break down by price, like just kind of all the things you'd expect in a product with a very simple visual aesthetic.
And did you and like Steve have like an aura at that point, like coming out of Reddit? Was it like easier to hire, easy to fundraise, like the way that it would be now if you had a Reddit like exit?
I think it definitely helped. I mean, what actually did help there too was the, Hipmunk was also a YC company. And so getting back into YC was also easier having already done it once. Part of doing startups well is you have to be able to get your knocks at some point. And so already having had a startup behind your belt and an acquisition behind your belt helps a lot. I think also the other things that came up were like, we had to exist as architects at a pretty decent sized product with a decent user base. And therefore, we were pretty good engineers at that point. Like we knew web development really well. If anything, the learning curve for Hipmunk was the time when like App Store was really starting to take off. And so we had to start learning like how different the requirements are of dealing with like with the Play Store and with the App Store on iOS. That was a new muscle, but it wasn't a difficult thing to hire for. It was difficult to do well at that point in history.
Did you get into like at that point? I mean, like you said, Reddit, you had to do no marketing. It was all word of mouth. This time, did you get into like paid ads or what do you remember? What was your big acquisition channel?
Some of the early hires we had to do at Hipmunk that we never even came to mind at Reddit. We had to hire a BD lead extremely early. And that was because that was entirely to make deals with airlines and hotels and larger companies. It just required attention. And it required somebody who had some experience doing BD as a profession. Marketing was also extremely early. It started off with like, I remember actually even at the time, back in 2010, 2011, we hired our first like social media manager, which having just been at Reddit for so long, the idea of like a person whose job it is to manage social media, like what the hell was this? Like, how is that a job? Though also another thing that came up around that year, like 2010, 2011 was also the first time I heard the word data scientist. I'm like, data scientist? You mean that has a name now? It's like we just used to have to like you just dig through the logs and you get the answer. Like I didn't know that was a full-time job. So those are definitely like the earliest part of the team, like the first 12 employees, give or take, included at least 2 people working on BD and at least 1 person doing marketing. And the rest of it was mostly software engineers, but there was like a customer service element as well, where we actually had to have like we were dealing with money. And the side effect of dealing with money is you have to pay to have a CS team around to answer questions because the last thing you want to do is have some person stuck in limbo with their money.
And did you ultimately with Hipmunk, like did you guys get to product market fit, would you say?
What we learned most with Hipmunk was we definitely solved a set of user problems really well. And we had like some really rampant support, like users who really loved using the product. I think what we learned though was economies of scale are a bitch. Having a small product like Hipmunk meant that we couldn't take advantage of just the bulk discounts you start getting when you have volume. Originally, we went into it with a bunch of disdain for the large players because it's like, look how crappy their product is. Yeah, their product is crappy, but they're booking $1 billion in revenue, right? And so you can afford a lot of crappiness if you can actually get that much lead gen because you can spend a ton of money on marketing and just get more users to come in. You can buy a Super Bowl ad. And have it be completely reasonable.
Well, it's often with like, you're talking about flights, this is kind of different, but I always like most flights customer service when you're in, like, it's just terrible. And sometimes I talk to people about this and I'm like, the problem is when it comes down to it, I'm cheap as shit and I'm going to take the cheapest flight that gets me fastest. And I don't care if they treat like they might have yelled at me when I was on the plane, but if it's the cheapest flight that gets me fastest, I'm going again. Right. So like,
well, and that's the thing too, is like the flight is the means to the end. you're on the flight because you have to be, and you don't have a lot of choice. And it's like a temporary purgatory before you're doing the thing you actually want to do. Like no one takes a flight because they're like,
it's just, oh, great, I'm going to fly around. Yeah.
I want to spend 6 hours in this metal tube with a bunch of humanity. Right. It's like, no, you do it because you're going to go to freaking Maui, right? And you have to get on the plate to get to Maui.
Exactly.
Which is also why we found that like it's straight. That's why we chose agony as our sort, because like everyone hates, like there's very few people who are like, oh, I love flying, right? Even people who have like, at this point in my life, I have 1K status, which, as we all know, isn't like a good thing. It just means I fly enough that I like actually got status. Right. Yeah. Right? It's a mark. It's like the mark of the beast, right? It's like, oh, I'm sorry, you have 1K. Or like I remember I was on a plane at one point recently, and like the guy behind me hit his like 3 million mile mark, and there was this kind of like everyone around him was like, congrats. Whoa. Like, are you okay? Like, all right, man? It's like,
you're okay, dude.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's like, and he wasn't old. He was like younger than I was. I was like, oh man, you spent a lot of time in planes.
Yeah, that's rough.
It's like that George Clooney movie from like 20 years ago. I was Up in the Air. It's like he realized he spent his entire life on planes. Yeah.
No good. So walk me through. Did you guys end up selling that? Like, 'cause I'm interested, obviously, in the transition back into Reddit. Like, did you end up selling Hipmunk, or how do you come back to Reddit? How does that happen?
So we hit, I think by about 2015, Hipmunk was in kind of like a good steady state. And like I would say, like from my standpoint, a lot of the technical problems were kind of like solved, or were just a matter of like kind of playing an existing playbook. Like there wasn't a lot of difficult work to be done there. And so what happened for me was I ended up consulting for Reddit mid 15. Because at that point, they were starting to scale up a little bit more. The company was up to around 70 employees. They were looking at actually building a mobile app. They were looking at doing something that, some of the stuff that I had originally specialized in retrospect, was I became like an infrastructure generalist. I became probably one of the first SREs in the team, just as like nature of the beast. I also ended up being one of the first people to work on what amounts to being, we eventually called anti-evil, which is like our user safety stuff. It was me, and actually I was kind of secondary to another guy, Mike Schiraldi, who's a good friend of mine now, who was like the first. I don't know. At the time, he was more like the troll poker. Like he would help to fend off the trolls and put them back under their bridges. And got really good at building out the toolkit for making sure the users actually had some amount of safety. Coming back, the things that were top of the list for me were working on that safety toolkit, and so I ended up kind of doing some consulting along those lines, talking about mobile usage, talking actually about data science, which wasn't really a function that existed much at Reddit at that point. Which again, like my title at Hipmunk was actually chief scientist, which like most of my titles historically was kind of a joke, but at the same time it actually was accurate. It was like, I was a scientist, but also data science had come on the scene around that time, and so it made sense to say like, well, Chris can work in analytics. And then by the end of that year, it was kind of like I've made this analogy a bunch of times, but I have to repeat it. It's like, it kind of had the same feeling as dating your ex-girlfriend, where it's like, you dated a long time ago and you broke up for very good reason, but that was like 5 years ago.
Right. Have you changed?
You both changed as people. Yeah. So like, let's just see what happens. That was actually exactly kind of how it felt, where like, I had thought that I had emotionally separated myself from Reddit. And then actually by about mid-year in 15, Reddit was going through some tough times. They had a major blackout that was kind of infamous, like the first real modern blackout. And there was this kind of possibility that Reddit would cease to exist. And that hurt in a way that I wasn't expecting. It was almost like, oh God, I'm twisting metaphors in a bad way here, but I'm going to do it. It was like, it was like seeing your kid like in tough times. Like, we kind of worked really hard to kind of like get you going, and then you find out that later on they're kind of like leading a rough life. So maybe it's time to swoop back in and see if you can actually help.
Well, especially when it was a known brand, real brand with real users, a real community. Like the thought that could go away, yeah, I could see that being not easy to accept, not easy to swallow.
Yeah, and I think to some extent too, like we just had a different model for how to approach Reddit, the community as well. Of like I remember historically, there's always been pitchforks and torches on Reddit. That's kind of the nature of the product. And prior to 2010, some of the ways to solve the problem would be like the community would get ahead of steam about something, and then Steve would appear and Spez would just comment, no. And they'd be like, and I remember there was one case where it happened like in like 2008, 2009, where like he just replied no. And then the response he got was, Okay, guys, let's just call it clearance or
Hey, we got
clearance from the admins. They're not into it. So let's move on.
It's crazy, the persona of Reddit. Like, it's pretty wild. It's just pretty wild to look from the outside, and yeah, it's so unique.
It's very much so.
I was gonna ask, like, you mentioned the mobile app. What took so long, right? Like, App Store comes out in 08, 09. I just have to ask that, it's nothing to do with product market fit, but you would think.
Oh, I know. I mean, that's a fantastic question. So actually we had a couple of early forays into it. I think that I can start off with like saying, the first answer is like, honestly, capacity. Like we had a very small team at that point. Like I said, we had like 4 or 5 engineers tops. And so rather than spending time learning a new kit, we initially decided to just build like a mobile experience that was actually not bad. And so early on, there was actually I wonder if it still works. I'm going to really quickly just check and see if this thing is still in existence. And no, it's not anymore. Okay, good. We used to have a particular view of Reddit that was optimized for mobile browsers. And at this point, 2008, we weren't just targeting iPhones. We were targeting like BlackBerry, like, Research in Motion, and like Palm OS and all those kind of features where like, we didn't know what was going to be the clear winner. So we just picked that. Second, we actually did at one point bring in some like a contract firm to build us a first version of a Reddit app. And then subsequently, after about 2008, when we open sourced, we started having more of an ecosystem of third-party usage of Reddit appearing. And early on, there was a whole set of third-party apps that developed. And in fact, to the point where I believe in 2013, 2014, it's after I left, but like Reddit bought one of the major iOS apps called Alien Blue. And then kind of like, relied on that as the iOS solution for a while with no equivalent solution for Android. By about 2016, the idea was that we were looking to probably do a little bit of a bit of a zhuzh of the look of Reddit and do some cleanup. And at the same time, it was worth actually investing in some first-party clients that really were kind of taken from the ground up, that had a particular kind of like more modern style.
The other thing I wanted to touch on is the monetization piece. I mean, you mentioned it wasn't really a focus, I guess, until about you guys came back in 2015, 2016. I'm curious just what worked, like fundamentally, what were some of the big things that you did? I mean, you think, okay, you're going to make money on ads, like, but what were some of the key kind of things that you implemented that really drove, the real sort of revenue that you have now?
Okay, well, 2 things. One of them is going to sound like a cop-out, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things that actually had the most impact for revenue was just freaking grit. And the reason I say grit is because trying to bootstrap an ads business, it really was bootstrapping at that point, because we're talking about very low numbers even in 2015. Trying to bootstrap an ads product on top of a quote-unquote social media platform was extremely difficult, given the fact that we had made a bunch of different choices from the rest of social media, right? Like, we had no real user data. We have basically interest data, right? We have everything is in the public and in the clear. You go to the front page, you're going to see the good and the bad of Reddit based on popularity. That's the value proposition of the product, is that it's going to be an unvarnished view of what people are talking about. No walled gardens, no like fancy look and feel. And so it really was educating advertisers over a very long time. And like, really kudos to our ads team and our sales team, then to now, of just having to continue that path of saying like, no, we're differentiated. We have a different value proposition than what you get off of social media. We're not really social media, but we'll pretend to be, or at least we'll call ourselves that. It's the cleanest bucket. The second thing that actually came up, like early on, we actually did do a self-serve product in 2008. It actually was the first version was my build, where we wanted to actually have users be able to buy screen real estate on Reddit directly with a credit card. And from about 2016 on, it was rebuilding that into a modern auction, actually doing it in a CPC model as opposed to a CPM model, which is a lot harder to explain. Building out things like tracking pixels, like really building the whole kit and caboodle of what is expected on a modern ads platform. But again, with a start date of 2016, as opposed to everyone else who had started kind of like in the early teens. Lots of catch up, but also the nice thing about catch up is that you do get a chance to take advantage of the modern toolkit. It's like I do have a certain amount of we made it all the way into the 55-minute mark or so without me saying LLMs. And I will say that, I mean, this is a tech podcast. Somebody has to say LLMs at some point. I think That's right. But like, there's a certain advantage of being a startup now and being able to like take advantage of the full kit of like kitchen sink ML technology. is actually ridiculously powerful for like, especially building the first version. Like, you can save yourself some amount of agita just doing it using the modern toolkit of just like, simple experience, asking a bot to help you build it, and like getting moderation for free, or at least getting some amount of like content understanding kind of comes for free these days, which is really nice and powerful.
Well, listen, Chris, we'll stop it there. I'll ask the two questions that we always end up on, which, the first one for Reddit, you kind of touched on this, but I'll ask it anyways. Like, when did you feel like Reddit had like true product market fit?
In hindsight, it was pretty clear that it immediately solved a need that we didn't know was unmet. And that I think that I would say, if I'm going to pick a date, I would say probably like when we launched subreddits. It was pretty clear that like was a thing that meant that Reddit could continue to grow and scale past a relatively small community of nerds, frankly.
The other question I have is, having gone through this journey, over the last 20 years, and especially since, you're an angel and certainly a mentor and advisor to a lot of early stage founders, like what are some of the most common pieces of advice that you find yourself giving early stage founders, or if you could give yourself, back then, however you want to think about it?
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that some of the things I actually, at this point in my career, I have entire like mental frameworks about scaling orgs, which I find terrifying to say out loud. It's like, again, having 1,000 people on my team right now means that I don't think in terms of like individuals, I think in terms of teams and like org shapes. And so just like, the evolution of a startup, there's a point usually that happens around the kind of like Series B phase, which is almost like the startup adolescence phase, where it's like nothing quite fits. You don't really know what you're doing anymore because you kind of like you've had enough success to like get a couple of rounds of VC, and usually that's when they you try to like expand the product portfolio, and you discover that things aren't sticking as well as they were on your mainline product. And you're also going through the team growth phase of like, there's a switchover that happens at around 50 people where you go from effectively a small tightly knit family, almost, not to abuse the term, into more of a like, no, there are just people who are your coworkers who you don't necessarily know very well. And that can be very tough for startups to go through because there's so much initial work that is based on implicit distributed trust across the entire company. Those two things tend to hit about the same point, which is usually around the Series B. And that's a fun problem where you start having to apply, think about things. You think about teams rather than individual people. That's usually the point also where you have to like, hire like a real manager, like hire somebody who's been a director before, to actually start like laying out processes that actually help you scale your business. And I think that was actually the place where, that's where I feel like I learned the most at Hipmunk, was actually building a company up to 100 people. And then also got a chance to start deploying that toolkit coming back to Reddit when it was roughly the same size.
Well, Chris, it was great having you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
I just gave you content that you liked so much, you actually listened to the end. And guess what? You didn't pay a single dollar. Not only that, I didn't even put any ads in your face. So you just got a bunch of content for free. And now that I've delivered that value, I'm asking for something in return. Open your app. Open Apple Podcasts, open Spotify, open whatever app you use to listen to this, and hit that follow button. It's actually going to help you because it's going to help you make sure you don't miss out on the next episode, which you like so much that you listen to the whole thing.